In the decades following the Second World War, as the Soviet Union transformed from a nation devastated by conflict into a superpower locked in ideological combat with the West, the Communist Party faced a challenge that went far beyond nuclear arsenals and space races. They had to prove that socialism could deliver not just industrial output and military might, but also leisure, comfort, and a vision of the future that ordinary citizens could touch, taste, and experience. The answer came in an unexpected form: cafes and restaurants that defied convention, establishments that turned public dining into theater, propaganda into pleasure, and urban space into a laboratory for socialist modernity. These were not merely places to eat, they were statements of intent, architectural manifestations of a system determined to demonstrate that it could match and even surpass the capitalist world in imagination and innovation. The first of these experiments emerged in the early 1950s, when Soviet planners turned their attention to a concept they had observed during pre-war visits to the United States: the automat. American cities in the 1930s had pioneered vending machine restaurants where customers could insert coins and retrieve ready-made meals from glass compartments, eliminating waitstaff and streamlining service. Soviet industrial planners, always attentive to methods of increasing efficiency and reducing labor costs, saw potential in this model. By 1954, Moscow opened its most ambitious automatic cafe near the iconic Detsky Mir children's store, a location chosen deliberately to attract families and demonstrate Soviet technological prowess in the heart of the capital. The establishment was a marvel of mechanization. Approximately 40 dishes, both hot and cold, were available through automated dispensers. Customers purchased tokens at a central cashier, then moved through the space, selecting their meals from machines that heated, stored, and delivered food with minimal human intervention. According to Soviet Trade magazine, the establishment served roughly 10,000 people daily, an extraordinary throughput that showcased the system's capacity to feed the masses efficiently. The cafe operated for 7 years, from 1954 to 1961, before the inevitable failures of Soviet manufacturing caught up with the concept. The machines broke down with increasing frequency, spare parts proved difficult to source, and maintenance became prohibitively expensive. By 1961, the experiment ended, and the space was converted into a conventional canteen. The failure was instructive. Soviet industry could replicate Western concepts, but it struggled to maintain them over time, a pattern that would repeat across countless sectors throughout the Cold War. Yet, even as the automatic cafes faded, a new wave of architectural experimentation was beginning, driven by the space-age optimism that gripped both superpowers in the 1960s. When Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space on April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union claimed a propaganda victory of immense proportions. The Communist Party moved quickly to capitalize on this triumph, infusing everyday life with space-themed imagery and rhetoric. Into this atmosphere came Finnish architect Matti Suurinen, who, in the mid-1960s, designed a prefabricated house in the shape of a flying saucer. He called it Futuro, and it was intended as a vision of modern living: compact, portable, futuristic. Several of these units were imported into the Soviet Union, and in Krasnodar, a city in the southern reaches of the Russian Federation, one was repurposed as an ice cream cafe named Sputnik, the Russian word for satellite, and the name of the first artificial satellite launched by the USSR in 1957. The Sputnik Cafe was placed in an ordinary residential district, not in a showcase area or a tourist zone, but amid the apartment blocks where regular Soviet families lived. This was deliberate. The party wanted citizens to encounter the future in their daily routines, to see socialism as inherently forward-looking. Children especially were drawn to the structure, its sleek curves and otherworldly appearance, a stark contrast to the gray uniformity of Soviet residential architecture. The cafe became a popular destination for families, a place where the promise of space exploration was made tangible through the simple pleasure of ice cream served in a building that looked like it had descended from orbit. Beneath the streets of Moscow, another form of culinary innovation had been underway since the very beginning of the metro system. When the first line of the Moscow Metro opened in 1935, it was immediately hailed as one of the most beautiful subway systems in the world. Its stations adorned with chandeliers, mosaics, and marble columns. But the metro was not just a showpiece. It was also a practical system designed to move millions of workers efficiently. And from the outset, planners understood that passengers would need food and refreshment. Buffets were installed at key stations, including Okhotny Ryad, where travelers could purchase ice cream, candy, and soft drinks. These were modest establishments, but they represented a recognition that socialist infrastructure had to accommodate human needs beyond mere transportation. In the post-war years, as the metro expanded and ridership surged, buffets appeared at additional stations: Airport, Biblioteka imeni Lenina, Kropotkinskaya, and Komsomolskaya. These were not elaborate dining spaces, but they were accessible and affordable, embodying the socialist principle that basic pleasures should be available to all. At Arbatskaya Station, a buffet originally intended for train drivers in the Soviet era remains operational today, now open to the general public, a small but enduring remnant of a system that sought to integrate work, transit, and daily sustenance into a seamless whole. If the metro buffets represented pragmatism, the Sedmoye Nebo restaurant represented ambition on a scale that bordered on the absurd. Sedmoye Nebo, which translates to Seventh Sky, was not merely a restaurant. It was a declaration of Soviet technological superiority, a dining experience that literally elevated patrons above the city and symbolically above the concerns of everyday life. The restaurant was located in the Ostankino television tower, which upon its completion in 1967 stood as one of the tallest freestanding structures in the world. At 330 meters above the ground, the three-level restaurant was among the highest dining establishments anywhere on the planet. But the tower's designers were not content with mere altitude. They engineered the restaurant to rotate, completing one full revolution every 40 minutes, allowing diners to take in a panoramic view of Moscow as they ate. The technical challenges were immense. Cooking was prohibited in the tower for safety reasons, so the menu consisted of set lunches that were prepared elsewhere and heated on site. The space was small, accommodating only 80 guests at a time, and access was controlled through the sale of individual tickets, making a visit to Sedmoye Nebo a special event rather than a casual outing. For Soviet citizens, dining there was an experience layered with meaning. It was a chance to see their city from a vantage point previously reserved for pilots and cosmonauts, to feel, however briefly, as though they were part of the elite. The restaurant operated successfully until a catastrophic fire struck the Ostankino Tower in August 2000, forcing its closure. For 15 years, the structure sat empty, a reminder of both Soviet engineering prowess and the fragility of such ambitious projects. When it reopened in 2016, it was in a different country, serving a different clientele, but the space itself remained a monument to an era when the state invested heavily in spectacle as a form of ideological persuasion. As the 1960s progressed, the Soviet leadership began to recognize that grand gestures alone were insufficient to capture the imagination of the younger generation. The cultural thaw initiated by Nikita Khrushchev after Stalin's death in 1953 had opened space for new forms of expression, and Soviet youth were increasingly exposed to Western music, fashion, and attitudes through clandestine channels. Jazz, once condemned as decadent capitalist noise, was gradually tolerated and even embraced as a form of cultural diplomacy. Into this environment came a new type of establishment, the youth cafe. These were budget-friendly spaces with bright neon signs and cheerful music, designed explicitly to appeal to students, artists, and young professionals. In the first years of the 1960s alone, more than 300 such establishments opened across the Soviet Union in cities from Leningrad to Vladivostok. Many operated as conventional cafes during the day, serving inexpensive meals and coffee, but in the evenings they transformed into jazz clubs where live music filled the air and patrons could linger over drinks and conversation. These cafes became vital social spaces, places where writers, poets, and intellectuals could gather outside the watchful eyes of official institutions. The state tolerated them, even encouraged them, because they provided a controlled outlet for youthful energy and creativity, a way to channel dissent into cultural production rather than political resistance. Yet they were also sites of genuine freedom, spaces where the rigid orthodoxies of Soviet life could be momentarily set aside, where a sense of individuality and spontaneity could flourish within the boundaries of acceptable behavior. In the same period, another form of unconventional dining emerged, one that repurposed the machinery of the Soviet state in whimsical ways. Decommissioned airplanes, relics of Aeroflot's expanding fleet, were frequently placed in city parks and converted into cafes or children's cinemas. These establishments bore names that evoked flight and adventure: Flight, Liner, Icarus. The choice of aircraft as venues was not accidental. Aviation had been a source of immense pride for the Soviet Union since the early days of the revolution, when pilots like Valery Chkalov became national heroes for their long-distance flights. By the 1960s, as jet travel became more common, older propeller-driven planes were retired, and rather than scrapping them, municipal authorities saw an opportunity to transform them into public attractions. For children, these airplane cafes were thrilling, a chance to sit inside a real aircraft, to imagine themselves as pilots or cosmonauts. For adults, they were nostalgic, a reminder of the Soviet Union's achievements in aviation, and a symbol of a state that could turn even obsolete technology into something useful and enjoyable. The airplane cafes were modest in scale and ambition compared to the Sedmoye Nebo, but they were accessible and beloved, woven into the fabric of everyday life in a way that grand projects often were not. By the 1980s, as the Soviet economy stagnated and the state's grip on private enterprise began to loosen, yet another form of unconventional dining appeared: the tram cafe. These were decommissioned trams converted into small eateries, often operated by individuals or cooperatives taking advantage of new regulations that permitted limited private business. The concept was simple and constrained by necessity. Organizing a full kitchen in a tram was difficult, so the menus were limited to the simplest dishes: sandwiches, pastries, tea, and coffee. But what these establishments lacked in culinary sophistication, they made up for in atmosphere. In Moscow, one tram cafe famously circulated around Chistya Ponds, a picturesque area in the city center, and it became enough of a local landmark to appear in Soviet films, a testament to its cultural resonance. The tram cafes were emblematic of the contradictions of late Soviet life. They represented a grudging acknowledgement that the state could not provide everything, that private initiative had a role to play, yet they also carried a sense of improvisation and decline, a sense that the grand socialist project was fraying at the edges. Taken together, these 7 types of establishments tell a story that goes far beyond food and architecture. They reveal a state engaged in a constant negotiation between ideology and pragmatism, between the desire to project an image of modernity and the reality of chronic shortages and inefficiencies. The automatic cafes of the 1950s were an attempt to prove that Soviet industry could match American innovation. But their failure exposed the weaknesses of Soviet manufacturing and maintenance. The Sputnik Cafe in Krasnodar and the Sedmoye Nebo restaurant in the Ostankino Tower were propaganda made physical, spaces designed to inspire awe and reinforce the narrative of Soviet superiority. Yet they also required constant state support and were vulnerable to the same systemic problems that plagued the broader economy. The youth cafes and jazz clubs of the 1960s represented a calculated risk, an effort to co-opt and control cultural expression rather than suppress it outright, and they succeeded in creating spaces of relative freedom that became essential to the intellectual life of the era. The airplane cafes were exercises in resourcefulness, turning obsolete machinery into community assets, while the tram cafes of the 1980s were symptoms of a system in crisis, signs that the state could no longer sustain the illusion of total control. These establishments were not merely footnotes in the history of Soviet daily life. They were instruments of statecraft, tools used to shape public perception and manage social behavior. Every design choice, every location, every menu item carried political weight. When the state placed a flying saucer cafe in a residential neighborhood, it was making a statement about the accessibility of the future under socialism. When it built a rotating restaurant in a television tower, it was asserting dominance over both physical space and the collective imagination. When it allowed jazz clubs to operate, it was making a calculated gamble that cultural liberalization could be contained and managed. And when it permitted tram cafes to proliferate in the 1980s, it was acknowledging, however reluctantly, that the old model was no longer sustainable. The legacy of these unusual Soviet cafes and restaurants extends beyond nostalgia. They remind us that the Cold War was fought not only with missiles and spies, but also with architecture and ice cream, with the mundane details of daily life that shaped how people experienced and understood their political systems. The Soviet Union ultimately lost that war, not because it lacked ambition or creativity, but because it could not sustain the systems it built, because the gap between propaganda and reality grew too wide to bridge. The automatic cafes broke down. The Sedmoye Nebo closed after a fire. The tram cafes became relics of a bygone era. Yet, in their moment, these establishments mattered. They were places where Soviet citizens could glimpse a different kind of life, where the promises of socialism felt, however briefly, within reach. Today, as we look back on these spaces, we see both the ingenuity and the tragedy of the Soviet experiment, a system that could dream big but struggled to deliver, that could inspire wonder but could not escape its own contradictions.